Hi there. Welcome to Act One Remarks of All's Well That Ends Well by Shakespeare. As you can see from the little book over here, this is mainly for my class, but if you're watching this and you're just reading the play, well, good for you, for one. And I'm really glad you're here. So this is an unusual Shakespeare play. Well, it's not unusual. I suppose what's unusual about it, it's very rarely put on stage, and there are very few movie versions of it that I know of. There have been a number of stage versions, every now and again by Shakespeare companies. And if you want to download a good version, by the way, the Globe Theatre in London has fantastic website where you can go and download some of their productions. And I think for around 12 quid, you can download their production. For my American viewers, that's about $15.60. Plus, of course, a foreign transaction fee if you have one of those credit cards. And thank you, credit card companies. Anyway, so go download the play and watch it. It's kind of an interesting interpretation, particularly of the character of Bertram, of which we'll talk about a bit more later. But I think that, well, perhaps I should just say right now, Bertram's a difficult character, and he's not a very appealing guy. He's the new count of Roussillon in France, and he's kind of at the center of the play. I think one of the difficulties of the play is, what do we do with this really unlikable character? And if you go watch that Globe version I was telling you about, they try their hardest to kind of understand this character and make him, I'm not sure if appealing is the right word, but certainly is a really good attempt at sort of understanding him as essentially immature. Is my read of that. Okay, well, let's get on with it. In Act 1 of the play, we begin in Roussillon in southwest France. It's near the Spanish border, near the Mediterranean. Sounds like a lovely place to go visit. We are with the Countess, who's grieving her late husband, who was the Count. Now the Count is her son. His name is Bertram. We were just talking about him. And nice little... Shakespeare's very fond of parallels in his plays between sort of unexpected places, or in unexpected places. So actually, immediately in the first act, we realize that Helena, who's really the main character of the play, her father has recently died too. So two people recently dead, I suppose, but two characters grieving. So the Countess is grieving her husband. Helena, who's also referred to in the text as Helen, but we'll call her Helena, she is grieving her father, Gerard de Narbon, which we'll get to in a second. Anyway, to go back to bullet point 1 here, Bertram is about to leave for Paris. I guess now that he's the Count, he has to go see the King and pay homage. And he's going with this, perhaps he's a family friend, Lord Lafeu. We find out that the King of France is seriously ill with an ulcer, or in the text it's called a fistula. Great word. Thirdly, we meet Helen a little bit. She's the daughter of a famous doctor, Gerard de Narbon, who we were talking about just now. The Countess really seems to like Helen. Helen privately expresses her love for Bertram. We also find out that Parole is. We also meet this guy Parole. He's Bertram's servant, and he has a funny conversation with Helena about virginity. A kind of interesting back and forth about that. In scene 2, we meet the king briefly. I said here he's a bit chippy. He's kind of fractious. He's obviously suffering from his fistula, his ulcer. I suppose the main thing we find out is that he has been asked by the Duke of Florence to send men to fight in a conflict with Siena. And he doesn't want to send all his men to Florence, so he says they can go fight for either the Sienese or the Florentines. So a lot happens in Act 1. So number 6 here, the Countess and the Fool have a kind of a banter scene. And we're going to talk about the Fool a little bit later in this recording, in scene 3. And then the steward turns up, another bit part, and he tells him that the Countess tells the Countess that Helen is secretly in love with Bertram. We're not really clear how he knows this. I think he says he overhears her. Finally, in scene 3, the Countess confronts Helen. The Countess actually remembers being young and in love, and it'd be interesting when she says that. Does Helen overhear her, and does Helen know that she's going to get a good audience with the Countess, or the Countess is going to be kind of receptive? Whatever the case, the Countess says she's very happy. Well, once she's convinced Helen to spill the information, to spill her guts, so to spill the beans. Sorry. Then the Countess is happy that Helen wants to marry her son. Helen reveals that she wants to go to Paris to help the king, and is not exactly clear about whether she wants to get Bertram, but we suspect so. I thought this might be fun to have a look at. Where are we? Well, of course, Shakespeare was here. This is a map of Europe in about 1600. And so here's Shakespeare in London. I drew 3 little arrows here. Roussillon is around here in southwest France. The king is up in Paris, up here. And he said the soldiers can go off to Italy, to Tuscany. So here's this area, Tuscany. And the main cities still today, I suppose, are Florence and Siena, and they're the 2 towns who are fighting. Those 3 places are the locations of this play. Not many Shakespeare plays take place in England, apart from his history plays, like Henry IV and Richard III and all that. But aside from those, very few. I think it's only 1 or 2 take place in England. Fun fact. Talking about class, well, a couple of issues I want to talk to you about in Act 1. I mean, it goes on through the whole play, but social class is a big part of Act 1. So to look at the bullet points here, Helena, well, I suppose here's this nice diagram here of kind of, you've got the nobles and it says the plebeians here. I might just say nobles and everybody else. But at the top, you've got the king, the queen. In Shakespeare's life, it was mostly Elizabeth I, but when he wrote this play, this was a bit of a later play. I think it's 1605, 1607. But when he was writing, King James was on the throne, so he was a king. Some of the church, I guess this is saying that some of the church would have been considered not noble. Some of them would be, I suppose, archbishops and so on would be nobles, and knights, people like Bertram up here. Tip of the iceberg, right? Most people are not. The vast majority of people in medieval and Shakespearean England, including merchants, are of course not nobles. Merchants might have been probably moved to and fro, and you can see they're higher up the pyramid. They certainly would communicate with nobles and with non-nobles. But anyway, Helena is down here, Parol's down here, and then the Fool is down here, of course. Most of the characters are actually in this little bit in the top: the Countess, the King, the Lords, Bertram, and so on. Anyway, back to this. Helena is a famous doctor's daughter, but nowhere near the status of the aristocracy or of the nobles. Bertram doesn't really talk to her when he leaves. He only says 1 or 1.5 lines to her, which is essentially "look after my mother." And she says about him that I should think to love a bright particular star and think to wed it. He is so above me. She almost sees the idea of marrying him like the idea of her marrying marrying a star, right? An actual star. It's out of the question. Other characters, next bullet point, perhaps everyone else in the play seems certain of their position, and we're going to see that a lot more in Act 2, particularly with Lord Lafew and with the interactions of the Countess and the Fool. So the first 2 bullet points on the right here are suggesting that, there is this rigidly enforced class system in the play that Shakespeare constructs. And yet, particularly the characters of Parolles and Helena, or really those 2 characters, I think in some ways kind of push against those social constraints. And so, for example, right at the beginning of the play, they have this conversation, which I mentioned earlier in the first scene, about virginity. And in that conversation about virginity, and this and that, essentially they show, there's an edge to that conversation, but it's kind of banter, it's two social, I'm not going to say equals at all, but similarly, they're joined through a kind of similar situation in terms of them being not part of the noble class. They are they're people who are sort of aspiring to rise up that social ladder. And for Helena, it's simply marriage. For Parole, as the play rolls on, we realize that he wants to be considered as a lord as well. He doesn't want to be dismissed as just a servant. But Helena says that, the quotation here just reinforces again her sense that she's not as good, or not as good a social class. We, the poor, are born, whose baser stars do shut us up in wishes. I think I put that quotation there to show you the word "we" there. She could well be saying "we," you and I, Parolles. There's other ways of reading that, but I kind of like the idea that she's talking about them. And also to go against the idea of rigid classes or not moving around classes, the Countess quite quickly in this act says, okay, I can think of you as a daughter and you could possibly marry my son. So she seems okay with her moving up from a doctor's daughter to a countess. So this play is kind of interesting. On the one hand, it seems to just tell us about the kind of class structures that we expect in a 17th century play. And on the other hand, there's this quality of kind of challenging or dreaming that they might not exist. And that word dreaming makes us think of things like fairy tales, magic, and so on. And there's a quality of that to this play, which we need to talk about, but not today. Sorry about that. We'll do it though. So the next slide is about the Fool. Okay, so the Fool and the Countess have a kind of bantering scene in this act, one of many in the play. And I think if you don't know about this tradition of the wise fool, then you should. And this particular fool, there's a lot of fools in Shakespeare's plays and many other plays and other texts of this period and earlier, is that kind of guy. This one is, I think, quite a funny one. Some of them are sort of more serious and have more insight. So just to go through the bullet points, Shakespeare usually imagines his fools as both funny and wise. The most famous example of the wise fool, kind of the serious fool, would be the fool in King Lear, who's always saying to the king, the truth, essentially, along with one of his daughters, but mainly he gets the truth from his fool. Quite often that truth comes with sort of, or the funnies, because obviously the fool is mainly there to entertain the audience, but the funnies often come with moments of insight. So he says to the Countess, "I am a poor fellow." She says, "Oh, are you?" Something like, "Are you well?" And he says, "No, madam, 'tis not so well that I am poor, though many of the rich are damned." It's, he's contrasting the poor and the rich. He's obviously making a bit of a jab at her because she's one of the rich and saying that she's damned right to her face. He's sort of having fun with a little bit of wordplay, but maybe also alluding to the whole, it is easier for a rich man to get through the eye of a needle and all that in this particular moment. I think the fool in this play also represents kind of the sensual side of the body. He's often making the crudest jokes in the play, and he seems to quite enjoy an almost flirtatious relationship with the Countess, which she seems to enjoy as well. And we'll see more of that in Act 2. But he says, "I have been, madam, a wicked creature, as you and all flesh and blood are." He insists on the corporeal nature of man, the kind of visceral blood, and kind of the blood and the body, the flesh and the blood. The word blood was really important in this play, and we're going to talk about that later as well. But I suppose this is one use of it, blood as part of a sort of living, excited, sensual, and unromanticized body. Sorry, this video is a little bit longer than some of the others, but I think Act 1 you kind of need to set things up. So here's some big questions for you as you read on. Maybe the big one of the play is number 1 up here. What the heck does Helena see in Bertram? He hardly says anything to her. We have no backstory, and she's just sort of head over heels for him. Is there a backstory that we don't know about? What's the deal? Is he just that good looking? Is she a bit dopey? I mean, the last of those doesn't sound right, because she shows herself to be basically very intelligent, very smart in the way that she talks to Parolles and to the Countess, and she kind of gets what she needs from the Countess, in that long conversation they have together. So I don't know. This is a big question, and you should probably think about it as you're reading it. How can you make sense of her wanting him? Second one here, what does love mean in the play? What do the characters think of it? We just talked about the fool, who pretty much says love is sex, unapologetically. There are other readings in the play. Third one here, what does honor mean to the characters? The king has a go at the courtiers for saying that they're all about honor, but basically being a bunch of kind of layabouts at court instead of going and fighting, which is why he sends them off to Italy. What does the play tell us about social class? Whoops. There we go. Does it serve any kind of purpose in society? Is it unfair? And I think we've been kind of talking about that. And finally, what is the place of women in this society? Think about the Countess. She's one of these classic literary figures who, she's a woman with power. You kind of wonder, would she have had that power if her husband was still around? But she has a sort of comfortable sense of her own power and strength. And then Helena, who is articulate, interesting, complicated, independent, wants something and goes and gets it. So here's two strong women right at the beginning of the play, and there's going to be more. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. That was Act 1, and more later. Take care. Bye.